So it's part of the transition from when we initially started our pre-heeling work, we were luring the dog in heel position. And by luring the dog in heel position, we make the dogs focus on our hands. So as we move our focal point off our hands into our face or our shoulders, one of the things we want to do, initially, we'll have the dog look at us, and we start with the hand behind our back or out of sight. And when the dog looks away from the hand to the handler, she'll mark and reward. And then gradually, as the dog gets better and better at this, so at first, Lindsay will tuck her hand completely behind her back. So the dog's looking at her and she has her hand out of sight. And then the dog looks at her, she brings her hand from behind to reward the dog. Now she'll bring it gradually closer and closer to the dog. So it's close to the dog's head, to the outside of the dog's head, and eventually she'll be able to hold her hand right next to the dog's face with food or a toy in it, and the dog knows to look up at her even though the hand is there, right? But initially it starts with the hand completely out of sight so that we can get the dog to do the pieces. Good. And you do this really incrementally, right? So the other thing you can do is, and not only there, so the dog ignores that hand movement and she marks it, right? So the dog's aware that the hand's moving back there, but not going to look at it until eventually it can go from behind the dog's head to beside the dog's head to the point where when you start walking and heeling, she'd be able to swing her hand back and forth just outside the dog's head, and the dog will ignore the hand, right? You can see the dog roll its eyes a little bit when she moves her fingers, which tells me she knows the hand's there, but she's learning now that she has to ignore it even though there's movement back there. It's sort of the same thing she was doing in the hold a second ago, where she was actually having the dog hold an item and moving her hands and waiting for the release. It's going to be the same thing with focus. The dog's job here, though, instead of just holding the item, is to actually keep her focus on her even though her hand is there. Good. Nice. Good. And we do this first with food, and then you'll switch to a toy eventually, to the point where you can have a toy in your hand, and the hand can be. You can also do this from the front. So go ahead and Lindsay, have her sit and ask for her to focus. She can put food in her hands and hold her hands to the outside and make the dog look at her. And notice how when the dog wants the left hand, when the dog looks at her, she rewards with the other hand. Good, right? So the dog wants to look at that hand. So you can do this exercise as well. Basically, when we transition, in our early work with the dogs, we do a lot of luring and using our hands to make positions. So naturally, the dogs are really focused on our hands because we've used them to actually create behavior. But as you go forward, you want the dog to look at you unless I'm directly luring the dog. And eventually she'll be able to have the dog look at her. She can swing her hands around, she can hold toys in her hand, whatever. And if she gives the watch cue, the dog learns to watch her even though she sees something she wants out in her hands. And if you do it here, it's easier to transition that to the heel position. So sometimes it's easier to do it initially in front and then do it in heel position. And if the dog goes for it, she just simply goes and closes her hand up and withholds a reward. Good. Nice.